Greetings, true believers. I'm Stan Lee, co-author of How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, and creator of Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, and a whole caboodle of other comic book characters that my legendary modesty prevents me from mentioning. Now, I'll be your host and guide as we journey together along the rambunctious road to comic book artistry, which is to say, it looks like we're stuck with each other for the next little while. Now then, let's start with the basics. And what can be more basic than having an artist teach us how to draw? Certainly better than a plumber. And what artist can be better suited to this titanic task than my co-author and good buddy, none other than John Buscema.
Thanks, Dad. Now let's draw comics.
The Marvel Way.
The first thing you'll need is a drawing surface. It can be a table like this one, or even a flat board you can place on your lap. So, next you'll need some drawing paper. Marvel artists use 2-ply Bristol board, large enough to accommodate artwork 10 by 15 inches. You'll also need push pins to keep your paper from slipping off the board. Thumbtacks work, so will tape.
Of course, you'll need a pencil. You didn't think it would be so complicated, did you? Now, some artists prefer a soft lead pencil, like the one John is using. Others, of a more delicate bent, select a finer hard lead, like this one here. There are many different pencil grades available. Which one you choose is up to you, of course.
Most professionals use an eraser like this. It's called a kneaded eraser.
But since Marvelites hardly ever make mistakes, let's move on. You'll need a simple drawing pen with a thin point for inking and bordering. A brush is a must. Your best bet is a sable hair, number 3. You'll also need a bottle of black India ink, of course. Any good brand will do.
These brushes are very expensive, and if you don't know how to clean them, you can ruin them. So what you do is swirl it around the water, rub it up against the glass jar, and gently rub it alongside the rag here. You come to a fine point.
And let's not forget a supply of white opaquing paint to cover those rare mistakes we make from time to time. That's better. Your T-square is an invaluable tool for drawing borders and for keeping lines parallel. A triangle, too, is a necessity for drawing right angles and working in perspective. And don't forget an ink compass for drawing perfect circles. Plus, you might as well get a pencil compass, too. Any or all of these tools of the trade are available at your favorite art supply store. Now, just to make sure we're using the same language when we refer to things, let's review the various names for many of the elements that make up a typical comic book page. The first page of a story with a large introductory illustration is called the splash page. Letters drawn in outline with space for color to be added are called open letters. Copy which relates to a title is called a blurb. The name of the story is naturally called the title. An outline around the lettering done in this jagged shape is called a splash balloon. A single illustration on a page is called a panel. The space between panels is called the gutter. And I'm sure you won't be surprised to learn that the zat is called a sound effect. Copy which represents what a character is thinking is, logically enough, a thought balloon. The little connecting circles on the thought balloons are called bubbles. I mean, we'd feel silly calling them squares. The regular speech indicators are the all-important dialogue balloons. The connecting arrows on the dialogue balloon showing who is speaking are called pointers. The words in the balloons which are lettered heavier than the other words are referred to as bold words or bold lettering. And this is my favorite part, where the names are. We call it the credits, just like in the movies. All this technical stuff, which nobody ever reads, showing who publishes the mag and when and where, usually found on the bottom of the first page, is the indicia. Now, don't blame me. I didn't make up that word. Copy in which someone is talking to the reader, but which is not within dialogue balloons, is called a caption. Don't worry if you're not remembering everything this time. One of the marvelous things about video cassettes is that you can go back later and watch it again. Put it on hold while you make all the notes you want to. Oh, and by the way, don't get impatient. We'll get to the drawing part when you least expect it. Moving right along now, we introduce you to an excellent example of one of Marvel's many widely heralded close-ups, so-called because the reader's eye has moved in about as close as possible. Now, this type of panel, in which the reader's view of the scene is from farther away, enabling the figure to be seen from head to toe, is called a medium shot. And here you have a long shot. In fact, since it shows such an extreme wide-angle scene, you might even call it a panoramic long shot, without getting anyone angry at you. When you're up above the scene, looking down at it, as in this panel, what else could you possibly call it but a bird's-eye view? Now, on the other hand, when you're below the scene of the action, where your eye level is somewhere near Spidey's heel, as in this panel, we're inclined to refer to it as a worm's eye view. A drawing in which the details are obscured by solid black or any other single tone or color is called a silhouette. And now that we agree upon the tools and the language, let's get on to the heavy stuff. Let's start drawing.
The most important thing is making a drawing look three-dimensional, making it look solid. In other words, like it's occupying space. We'll work on form using these three simple basic shapes: the cube, the sphere, and the cylinder. As we move along, you'll see that every drawing is based on one or more of these three shapes.
Here we see a simple handgun, without which there could hardly be any comic books, TV action shows, or movies. And if you ever want to draw a Western strip, you'd better take particular note of the fact that the barrel is really a cylinder. The bullet chamber is a cylinder encased in a cube, and the butt itself is based upon the basic shape of a cube.
Obviously, the details of the shapes are modified to suit the artist's desire and the drawing's purpose. But the thing to remember is the actual sphere, cube, cylinder construction beneath the drawing. In fact, every object can be broken down into one or more of these three shapes.
Take the automobile. Notice how there's a large cube representing the shape of the body, with a smaller cube denoting the window and roof area. An airplane is equally easy. For me, anyway. I don't have to draw it.
The purpose of this is to train you to think through the objects you see. See them as made up of any combination of our three basic shapes: the sphere, the cube, and the cylinder. A very important concept.
Just about as important as make mine marvel, of course. Well, now we come to what I'm sure you've been breathlessly waiting for: how everything we've learned relates to the human figure.
Notice that in this drawing we use cubes for the rib cage and the hip area, while cylinders form the basic construction of the arms and legs. Even the little band around his thigh follows the form of a cylinder. A few more lines and you've got
Daredevil, one of Marvel's most popular superheroes. Here are some more sphere, cylinder, cube examples. Do you notice how those shaded drawings look solid? Now, even spheres, cubes, and cylinders can use some embellishment.
This is called shading. Gives an object a sense of solidity. Proper shading reinforces the feeling of dimension.
We can pause here if you wish, and you can practice what you've learned so far. Or, oh, potential producer of phantasmagoric picture panels, you can grab your ruler, your T-square, and your triangle, because our next topic is perspective. Perspective is vitally necessary in making a scene look accurate. In other words, making things appear to be correctly placed in the foreground, background, and in between.
It's not an easy subject, but you've got to master it in order to draw comics. We'll make it as simple and clear as possible.
Before we can even begin to understand perspective, we must first learn the basic concept of a horizon line. Simply put, the horizon line represents the viewer's eye level. That's the spot in the picture where your own eye would be if you were there observing the scene. Now, this cube provides a simple example. Notice that the two sidelines on top seem to be coming together, the way train tracks appear to come together as they recede farther into the distance. Okay, then, let's continue drawing those two lines until they meet. The point at which they meet is the natural horizon line. That's our own eye level. And since the lines converge on only one single point, it's called, naturally enough, one-point perspective. That seems pretty simple. Even I understand it. Now let's watch John turn the cube like this. If we follow the new converging lines to their ultimate meeting place, we get a two-point perspective, with a horizon line slightly above the scene. This is what our two-point perspective cube would look like, with a horizon line exactly at eye level. And here's how it appears with a horizon line below the cube. Of course, you'll seldom use one simple cube for your perspective. So let's see how these principles apply to the kind of scenes you might be drawing. In this drawing, despite the size of the scene and the number of the buildings, you can see how everything converges toward one point. Therefore, it's a one-point perspective. You can probably guess what we're about to tell you. The perspective lines are converging to two different points, but along the same horizon line. Thus, a two-point perspective. Well, it had to happen. An example of three-point perspective. The point at which the converging lines come together and finally meet is called the vanishing point. But here comes the tricky part. Look way up above the building. There's a vanishing point too, but it's merely an arbitrary point. Here's an example of a three-point perspective with a third vanishing point well below the horizon line. Three-point perspective drawings are really very common, so practice them until they look right to you. And remember, even when the third vanishing point is at an arbitrary spot, all of the perspective lines which do not fall on the horizon line must fall at the same arbitrary point, or else the perspective will be all wrong. For example, let's say you want to draw the inside of a room. Sounds simple, huh? But what about the furniture? It's got to look natural, like it belongs, not like it's just floating. That's what perspective is all about.
Notice that the vanishing points are at eye level in order to have correct perspective. No matter where the viewer's eye level may be, everything falls into place.
You might want to put the tape on pause and see if you can copy this next example.
Notice the way the chair is angled differently than the other pieces of furniture in the room. Gives us a third, a fourth vanishing point on the same horizon line.
Now, try not to get impatient. I know it seems complicated, but it'll all make sense as we go on, we hope. Learning perspective also means knowing how to tilt or turn objects without making them look distorted. And here's how it's done. We all know that a perfect circle will fit perfectly within a perfect square. But if we change the position of the square, the circle must also change. It becomes an oval. However, because it's in perspective, it still looks natural.
If we draw a cube, which is nothing more than two squares in perspective, side by side, then draw two ovals within the squares and connect the ovals, we end up with a wheel drawn in perfect perspective.
We thought you'd enjoy these particular shots because they show, in typical Marvel scenes, how we put the figures themselves into proper perspective. Now, notice where the eye level is in each panel, as well as the location of the various vanishing points. Now, There might be something more important than figure drawing in comic book artwork, but we sure don't know what it is. You can't have superhero comic books without superheroes, and you can't have superheroes unless you draw their figures. But there's more to it than just drawing figures. You've got to be able to draw them the Marvel way, and that means as dramatically and as heroically as possible. So here's where it all starts to pay off. The average guy is about 6.5 heads tall. But look at this sketch of Reed Richards.
Notice that he's 8 3/4 heads tall. This extra height is one of the secrets that gives Marvel superheroes proportions which the world has come to expect. His shoulders are good and wide, and his hips are real narrow. And as you'll see in a moment, the male is drawn much more angular than the female. Another thing to remember, the elbows fall just below the waist. This is true of men and women.
And speaking of women, where would Reed Richards be without his stunning Sue?
Notice that she, too, is 8 3/4 heads tall, with her hips much wider in relation to her shoulders than they would be on a male. Obviously, we do not emphasize the muscles on a woman.
Now, discover the difference between a normally proportioned male and a heroically proportioned Marvel superhero. Note that the superhero is larger, with broader shoulders, more muscular arms and legs, a heavier chest, and even a more imposing stance. There's nothing weak-looking about the fella standing next to Captain America, but a superhero simply has to look more impressive, more dramatic than the average guy.
An important point to remember is to always slightly exaggerate the heroic traits. Ignore or leave out any negative, undramatic qualities.
Would you believe that virtually the same rules apply to the villains as to the heroes? Take a close look at these next two drawings of the dramatically demoniacal Dr. Doom. The illustration on top is rather ordinary. It lacks those special qualities which distinguish a Marvel panel. However, the second illustration is drawn in the dynamic Marvel style. Let's see what the differences are. Basically, there's nothing wrong with the top figure, but you can see how the one below is more exaggerated. Doc's arms and legs are heavier, more imposing. His feet are planted further apart, giving more majesty to his stance. His tunic is flaring, denoting action even though he's standing still. His chest is larger, and his hands are bigger and more powerful. The differences are subtle, but this is the way Marvel would do it. Train your eye to catch these elusive but essential variations. Still, there are exceptions to every rule. I'm sure you recognize the lovable Thing, but did you know he's only 6 heads high? And here's the Kingpin, barely 5 heads high. You see, the trick is to make him look squat without making him look like a panty waist. Incidentally, the smaller the head in proportion to the body, the heavier and more bulky the body will seem. And now that we've studied the figure, here's what you've all been waiting for. Most anyone can draw a stick figure. They're simple, they're fun, but most importantly, they're the easiest way for you to get the action and the position you want for your character. Now, go ahead and practice. I'll wait. Seriously, put the tape on pause and practice all you need to until you can create virtually any pose that you can think of.
Then once you've mastered the stick figure, add ovals for the hips and rib cage. The arms and legs are built by adding cylinders, and continue refining the drawing.
Remember to always draw through the figure. By that I mean, even if some portion of the body will be hidden by an arm or a leg, draw it anyway, like Iron Man here, about to spring at some malicious miscreant. You can eliminate what you've drawn later when you add the limb which will conceal it, but you'll be certain that every part of the anatomy is in just the right position.
When you've finished filling in the details, you erase the construction lines which have been drawn through. and the result should look something like this final figure of Old Shellhead.
Yeah, it should, if you're John Buscema. But don't worry, you'll get it with enough practice. Remember, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. Now, here's another example. This time, we've started with a stick figure in a typical Spider-Man pose. Notice the way his left knee is bending towards you. That's called foreshortening, and it's done a lot in comic book artwork, although we'll get to more about that later. As you can see, it's done mostly with basic cylinder shapes. Add those loose little lines until the figure starts to take shape. Then, as you continue, you will emphasize the important lines, and you eventually lose the others. As John says, it's like being a sculptor, and you're building this figure with clay.
This drawing process isn't easy, but the more you practice, the easier it will become. Train your eye until the lines almost begin to form in your imagination before you put them on paper. Always build your drawing starting with a loose sketch.
It's the best way. It's the professional way. It's the Marvel way. Action. It's a Marvel specialty, a Marvel trademark. Now sharpen your pencil, Pilgrim, because here's where we separate the men from the boys. Here's a series of poses depicting several different stages in the action of throwing a punch. I want you to notice how the first drawing and the last seem to have the most impact. These are the shots a Marvel artist would use.
Try drawing a series of stick figures performing some action, like running or throwing a ball. Depict as many different stages of that action as possible. Familiarize yourself with the moving body. Use as many lines as you need. Don't try to do a finished drawing. Just loosen up. Try to feel the action.
Well, don't just sit there, true believers. Go ahead. We'll wait for you. Hey, I didn't say we'd wait all day. All right. Compare your practice figures with these. Now, note how the action has been caught in a few simple lines. That's what you want to learn to do. Exaggerate your action, keeping your figure loose, supple, always in motion. The center line drawn through the figure from top to bottom is always drawn first. It gives you the curve or the swing that you want your figure to have.
Always remember, every pose has a certain rhythm to it. With one simple center line, you can determine that rhythm and then start building your entire figure around it. Now let's study some figures in motion to see which ones we like and which we don't. And why?
Both of these figures are rough sketches of someone running. But notice how much more dramatically this figure is moving. Why? Because his center line has more swing, impelling him forward with force and urgency. Now the same is true here. Both figures depict a reaction to a punch in the jaw. This figure is perfectly clear, but it simply isn't done in the Marvel style. It lacks the movement and the sharply curved center line of the other one. Notice how this figure is looser. The legs are bent and thrusting backwards as the arms jut forward. Notice how the head follows the center line, completing a graceful, fluid curve. Now that's the Marvel way, and the same rules apply to figures which are just standing. In these examples, the smaller figures are okay, but just okay. They're not particularly dramatic, they're not overly heroic, and most importantly, they're not very interesting. But the larger figures, showing the same poses, are much more dramatic and heroic. Consequently, they're more interesting. Here are some more examples. The variations may not seem to be major, and yet, as simple a device as thrusting the head farther forward or spreading the legs farther apart can make all the difference. They're simple, loose, free and easy, and although each was done with just a few sketchy lines, they're all Marvel-style drawings. Well, I know you're anxious to start drawing a complete figure now, so let's get to it. John has reduced the process to 5 steps. He's begun step 1 with a basic center line to determine the pose and the action curve. Moving quickly to step 2, he's constructing the sketch using the spheres, cubes, and cylinders we studied earlier. This is basic, but it's very essential. It's how the marvel artists do it. Step 3 is to draw through the figure, doodling and adding the basic details you'll need. Keep your pencil strokes loose, light, and graceful. If a line isn't right, don't worry. Just go over it lightly until it begins to assume the proper form. And don't be afraid to have more lines than you'll want in the finished product at this point. Remember, we're still building. Okay, once you've got the doodling lines in for all the basic details, study all the little sketch lines and now select the ones that you like the most. Go over those lines again, bearing down harder on the pencil. Take your eraser and clean up the unwanted lines. At this point, your drawing should be beginning to take shape. Remember how we added black tones, shading to our cubes, spheres, and cylinders earlier on? Notice how John gives the figure form and substance by the use of that same shading technique. And don't worry if your first figure doesn't come out looking quite this polished. If you're not satisfied, go back and start over. Be patient. Why, it might take as long as 2 or 3 days before you're as good as Big John. And now it's time to draw the human head, or even the inhuman head. Most everyone can draw heads and faces of some sort, but now we're going to find out how to do them right, the Marvel way. Profile first. It should generally fit into a square with just the nose and part of the chin protruding. The eyes usually come midway in the skull, between the top of the dome and the bottom of the chin. Now, dividing the skull into 4 even quarters from top to bottom, the nose will usually be in the second quarter, up from the chin, with the ears falling at about the same level.
Now the front view. Notice the head isn't a perfect oval because the jaw has a slope, which makes the bottom of the skull considerably narrower than the top. Look at these heads from different angles. Once you're familiar with the construction, you'll be able to draw the head in any imaginable position.
Let's begin with some basic tips. Heads are generally 5 eyes wide, with 1 eye distance between the 2 eyes. To determine the width of the mouth, draw lines from the bridge of the nose touching the outside of the nostrils, and where they cross the mouth line, that is the width of the mouth. Then, draw 2 more lines starting underneath the nose. They should run through the lower lip, right where it starts to turn up, and where those lines touch the bottom of the head, eureka! That's the width of the chin.
At this stage, keep your head simple. No extra lines in the forehead or around the nose and chin. Keep the nose small and the chin strong and firm. Don't let the hair just lie there. Give it body, thickness. Keep the mouth simple. Notice the curve of the upper lip. And just a small, simple line for the lower lip.
As you can see, there are many different types of good-looking males, be they human, amphibian, or whatever. Practice the basic rules. There are, of course, lots of variations, but if you stick to the principles, you'll be able to make any character heroic-looking, no matter what his origin or facial expression. Drawing the good guys is somewhat formularized, but the bad guys, hey, that's a different story. Here's where you can let your imagination run wild. As you know, your average vile and vicious villain comes in all sizes and categories. So, when creating the head, you can use any shape that grabs you, square, round, wide, whatever. But just make sure that his look complements his personality. And speaking of personalities, let's turn our attention to the beautiful but difficult to draw Marvel women. Fortunately, John is almost without peer when it comes to portraying sensuous femme fatales, and here's proof.
Remember the 5 basic steps, beginning with a profile. First, the head is drawn within an imaginary square. Then locate the eyes halfway down the face, like this. Now you have a benchmark for the eye and the nose. Note how the nose tilts out and up from the skull, and it's rather short. Using a soft, curved line, place the cheek from the ear to the front of the skull, halfway between the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the chin.
Notice also how John places the mouth well forward from the skull. Notice, too, that the lower lip is fuller than the upper lip, while the upper lip juts out farther forward. Also, see the angle line showing the relationship between the lips, the nose, and the chin.
Now draw the lady's eyebrow, but not too low, and employ a graceful curve like this. Bring the chin forward and find the proper positioning of the nostril by drawing a straight line from the mouth to the eye line.
I told you drawing the Marvel women is more difficult than drawing the male heroes, but stick with us because it does get easier. Keep the forehead rounded, never flat. Make the eyelashes a solid mass. Don't try and draw each little lash. And keep the lady's hair full and fluffy. I mean, after all, this is a Marvel woman you're drawing, pal.
Now we'll show you how to draw a front view like this. First, start with a well-proportioned egg shape. Don't worry if it takes a few tries to get the shape right.
Draw the usual eye line midway on the skull. Placing the eyes on the line is a breeze when you remember the skull is 5 eyes wide and there's 1 eye width between them.
Now draw the lines from the outside of the eyes to the center line of the head. Here is where you make your cheek lines and indicate the area for the mouth.
This is the home stretch, folks. About a third of the way up from the top of the lip to the eye line, indicate the nose. Place graceful eyebrows well above the eyes and sketch the ears, preferably one on each side of the head. Sharpen your pencils, because here is where the real drawing begins. There's no shortcut for this. You've got to really draw the gal's nose. Following Johnny's exquisite example, always make certain that the nose is a little narrower than the width of 1 eye, and make sure that it tilts upward.
Once the nose is done, you find the width of the mouth by drawing lines from the top of the nose past the nostrils. The upper and lower lip are positioned by continuing the cheek line through the mouth area.
And all that remains is to add a gorgeous head of hair and erase your guidelines.
Notice again that the eyelashes are a solid mass, and the eyes are slightly higher at the outside than they are at the inside corners. And there she is. It's not so hard if you remember that one little word, practice.
Naturally, being able to draw a head is really only a part of it. The big thing is to animate it, to put interesting expressions on the face.
These female heads were all constructed exactly like the one we just did. But notice how I can change the expression simply by making slight alterations in the mouth, the eyes, and the eyebrows. You can master it, too, if you follow these simple tips.
Keep the female face simple. Use no extra expression lines on the forehead or around the mouth or nose. Study your own face in the mirror. Oh, hi there. Well, practice making different expressions and see what happens to your face when you do. Study those expressions. You know, most artists are their own best models. The nice thing about it, the only equipment you need is a mirror and, of course, a face.
As far as expressions go, virtually the same rules apply both to male and female heads. So watch this segment repeatedly and apply the same principles to the various male characters you may wish to draw. It's fun to change the rules and be creative, but you have to master the rules first.
Let's say a story calls for a sophisticated villainess. Well, make the jawline a bit more angular and give the eyebrows a more sinister arch. Also, raise the outside corners of the eyes and straighten the nose just a bit. See the difference? She's still great looking, but by varying the rules just slightly, we've made her different altogether. And look at those swingy earrings for sophistication. Jewelry, clothes, hairdos, and other accessories help create the proper mood.
If you want to age her a bit, simply round out the jawline. Add a slight double chin, and with just one curved line under each eye, you can give the feeling of puffiness. Notice, too, that the earrings are smaller, also suggesting maturity.
Let's review a couple of things to make sure you've got it down right. This is what the correct marble eye should look like. Note the graceful curve of the eyebrow, and the eyelashes, as we mentioned, are a single soft mass. The eye itself tilts upwards just slightly. Whoever drew this eye was certainly not a graduate of the Marvel School. Individual eyelashes and eyes too long and narrow, they're definite no-nos. And if you let your eyes droop and draw eyebrows as a single curve, well, you're no Marvel artist.
A proper Marvel nose tilted upward and with small nostrils. In contrast, this nose is tilted up too much and the nostrils are too big. This one has bumps. A Marvel nose is always one smooth line, and the tip should not dip.
There is one word for how a mouth should look: pleasing. Faux lips are out this season, and every season at Marvel. And don't draw angular lips. There's no grace or softness to them.
This is a Marvel mouth and chin. See how the upper lip is placed farther forward than the lower one. It's firm, but don't put the upper lip too far forward or make it too thin. And don't draw a weak chin. This chin arrives 10 minutes ahead of the rest of the head. And the lips are too thick, with the lower lip jutting too far forward. Everything in your picture must work in harmony to produce a whole.
Otherwise, things such as eyes, noses, chins, and lips will draw attention to themselves at the expense of the rest of your drawing.
Put it all together, and no matter what angle the head is in, the nose is always tilted up just slightly. The eyebrow has a fluid curve, and the lips are pleasingly full and soft.
I know it takes work, but look at the results. Learn, practice, master the rules, and who knows? Maybe someday I'll be doing a video with you, and John will be out there taking notes. Could happen. A work of art, be it Rembrandt or Buscema, must have that magical ingredient of correct composition. Call it a layout, call it design. It all adds up to one vital point. You've got to put your picture together so it's both pleasing to the eye and gets the message across clearly and interestingly.
The simpler, the better. That's the first rule of Marvel composition. Make your designs exciting and powerful, but keep them easy to understand. Also notice how the important elements of this panel fall within the shaded area.
Important elements are grouped together rather than scattered. The shaded area, or prime shapes, are sensed by the artist as he draws. Never draw the shape first. Never squeeze elements inside of it.
The picture is sketched out with the shaded areas taking form in the artist's mind. Sometimes, after a picture is drawn, too many important elements fall outside the basic shaded area.
Now, in such instances, the artist just changes his drawing until everything falls within a pleasant, unified mass. You want to train your eye to find the patterns, and you'll soon see that the most complicated picture will lend itself to similar analysis as soon as you look at it.
The camera angle is another vitally important element of design. Like a movie director, you, the artist, must give the viewer's eye the best possible shot.
Here we see Dr. Strange entering a room. It's a flat, unexciting camera angle, nothing dramatic or unusual about it, but by changing the camera angle, see how the scene has a sense of urgency, of impending drama. Now here's good old J. Jonah Jameson yelling at Peter Parker on the phone. It's okay, but in a word, blah. Now, look at the intensity of this angle. Poor Petey is really getting it now. And here's Dr. Doom, being his usual rotten self. It tells the story, but nothing more. New camera angle, new Dr. Doom. You see, it's more menacing, it's more compelling. In a word, we now have a better layout.
Let's see camera angles the way any ordinary comic book company might do it, compared with the Marvel style. We'll use an Avengers story as an example. Here's how it would look in an average comic book.
Here, a monster is breaking into Avengers headquarters. Next, a reaction shot of our three heroes. And here we see Cap, Iron Man, and the Vision rushing to do battle. Now that's old Shellhead taking a swing at the big bad behemoth. And here we see the monster about to do our hero irreparable bodily harm. Now, Cap and the Vision are pondering their next move. These panels are drawn okay. They tell the story, the characters are recognizable, but they're lacking in raw drama and sheer excitement.
That's because most of the layouts are too vertical, too straight up and down, and the heroes are too stiff. They lack the power that Marvel Comics have.
You know, we could go on forever, but it's easier just to compare and see how it's done the Marvel way. For example, look at this close-up of the monster breaking in. He looks like a monster. He's dangerous, menacing, super strong, and deadly. And the three heroes aren't standing around like a trio of simpletons. With Iron Man in front, there's a feeling of movement here due to the placement of the figures. There's more action than the simple-looking straight-on panel. See the action, the drama, the feeling of power generated by our heroes? There's no comparison to the other example's uninspired side shot. Iron Man slugging the monster the way a superhero should, like he means it. Here, he doesn't look like a ballet dancer, like in the other version. Are you starting to get the picture? Look here. You can almost feel the power as Iron Man struggles to break free. Finally, the two Avengers look much more graceful, and the tilt of their bodies gives the feeling of far more urgency and excitement. Now, without any comments from us, see if you can tell why the second version of the next examples are infinitely better than the first.
Watch for interesting perspective shots and variety in the size of the figures, and less emphasis on putting everything in the center of the panels.
And if you still can't tell the difference between the fair layouts and the good ones, keep studying. I mean, we don't want you to end up working for the competition. Now, here's where you can follow, step by step, exactly how a page is penciled for a Marvel comic book. Just a little video magic to give you an idea of what we're going to end up with. Now, this is a Captain Britain story for a line of comic books we distribute in England. Let's follow the story as John lays it out. This first panel shows Captain America, followed by Captain Britain, racing down a corridor on a rescue mission. In this second panel, the villainous Red Skull is aiming a gun at his enemy, Nick Fury, who's hovering above him. Nick is held aloft by twin jetpacks, which he wears on his back. Fury reacts in surprise as he hears his name called by Captain America. Now, this panel is a shot of the Skull firing his gun point blank at poor old Nick. In panel 4, Nick drops to the floor as Cap rushes in to help him. Panel 5 is a very dramatic angle of the Skull sighting down the barrel of a gun. Here's where we wrap it up. Captain Britain, holding his unique armored staff, charges to the rescue.
Here's another look at how we build a panel.
Always think of what you're doing as a process. You are literally building pictures. You start with the basics and then
adding to it until you've got it.
No, we don't expect you to work this fast. Even Marvelous Johnny doesn't work this fast. But to save a little time, we're showing you the basics of how it's done in speeded-up action. What we do want you to do, however, is practice everything in this tape until it all becomes second nature to you. Remember, you can play this cassette over and over. And if it wears out, you can buy another one. We won't mind a bit.
The cover is probably the single most important page of any comic book,
without which you cannot tell a book by. It's got to catch the eye, and it's got to intrigue the potential reader. After all, if the reader doesn't pick it up, it means one lost sale. And Marvel doesn't like lost sales. Consequently, more thought and work go into the cover than any other page. Usually, the editor comes up with a basic idea and talks it over with the artist.
If there's time, the artist will do a number of layouts until one final version is agreed upon.
Now, for some typical comments and criticisms that you might expect to hear from typical Marvel editors. Not that we mean to imply there's anything typical about any aspect of Marvel Comics. Here's a sample layout for the cover of a magazine called Nova that didn't quite make it. If you listen carefully, you can hear the editor's typical, gentle, kindly observations. What's this garbage? The figures of Nova and Spider-Man are too small. They haven't got enough punch. Get back to the drawing board. Not bad, but Nova's the star of the magazine. Why am I seeing his back? Where's the drama in that? Wrong. There's too much wasted space on the right side of the cover. Hey, even though Spidey is just a guest star in this issue, we gotta see more of him. Of course, it isn't always that negative. Once in a while, you get something good, like... That's it! We get a good view of both stars, and they're larger than in layout number 1. Hey, and this is good perspective. Look, the reader's eye level is right up with the two heroes. That's the one. Great job.
There are a few tricks to laying out a cover that you need to know.
And here are some of them. You've got to leave enough room at the top for the logo. That's the magazine's title. And don't draw anything important here on the extreme right side of the page or on the bottom. That's where it's trimmed off at the printers. It's sort of a no man's land. Try to leave dead areas on the cover. Those are areas that are still exciting to the reader, but they're unimportant enough to be covered over by dialogue balloons or captions if the editor so decides. Always leave the drawing open for color is the expression that we use in the Marvel bullpen. Don't distract from the cover's glorious hues with too many black areas. Make the cover provocative enough so that the reader wants to buy the magazine, but try not to give the ending away or tip the reader off to any surprises. And now we're ready to put the final touch on a brilliant work. We're ready to learn the art of inking. Your illustrations may be works of art, but they can't be reproduced by the printer unless black India ink is applied to the original pencil drawing. That means that someone has to ink over the initial penciled artwork with either a drawing pen or a paintbrush, transforming each illustration into a carefully inked final product. However, an inker is not just a person who traces a pencil drawing. The inker must be an artist himself or herself. A gifted inker can make mediocre penciling look great, but a mediocre inker can also make great penciling look dull.
Inking requires concentration. Therefore, you should make sure your posture is correct. Don't slouch over your drawing board. Sit up straight. Ruling lines with your brush is far more difficult than using a pen, but the results are usually worth it. Just hold the ruler at about a 45-degree angle and run your brush along it like this. By varying the pressure of your brush, you can make lines of any thickness. Lines ruled with a brush are not as stiff as those made with a pen. Actually, they tend to have more character.
Become equally adept at both pen and brush. The brush requires more time to master, but if you use a pen exclusively, your finished drawings may seem stiff and lifeless. Now, these examples of brushwork are called feathering. Notice how some strokes go from thin to thick. They're all done with the same brush, merely by varying the pressure you use. In case you're wondering, John is using a Winsor Newton No. 3 sable hair brush. Same brush, different effect. John is now using the side of the brush rather than the tip. This is a very helpful technique for inking hair on a character's head, for example.
Experiment with your tools. Search for different effects. Use anything imaginable to get the effect you need. Open your mind. That's what art is all about.
Here's a well-inked panel. See how the lines vary in thickness? They're heavier on the underside of the bodies, away from the light. Now this gives solidity to the figures. And look how clear the picture is, even though there are a number of figures and a wealth of little details. You see, a good inker ensures that drawings will be understandable, no matter how complicated they might be. One way to achieve this is to use heavy blacks to make the figures stand out from the background.
Here's the same panel, but it's overworked. It's too dark, and there are too many lines. When it's reduced to comic book panel size, it's going to be tough to understand. Too much texture has destroyed the basic beauty of the drawing, and it's almost impossible to read.
On the other hand, here's an example of the other extreme. The inker here didn't use enough variety in his lines. The blackened areas are too skimpy and spotty, and they have no pattern. His lines are almost all the same weight, with no feeling of thick or thin. The characters, as you can see, just seem to blend into the background. It's boringly blah. Now, it's just as bad to keep a panel too light as it is to overwork it. The secret is to know when and where to place your strong black areas. Too little or too much will ruin your drawing.
The black areas here are concentrated on just one side of the figure. This technique accomplishes two things. First, it gives a feeling of dimension. Second, it directs the reader's attention to the character's face by framing it with massive black areas. The figures here are drawn realistically. See how bold and simple the heavy black shadows are? Again, there's one bright light source illuminating one side of the body and casting the other side in deep shadow. Keep your inking simple, with just one definite light source in each panel.
Now here, the main purpose is to create a mood of fear and menace.
Look at both panels. Now concentrate on the simplified panel. The blackened areas are simple vertical or horizontal forms, thereby creating a calm, motionless scene.
The dramatic exception is the large slanting black masses on the winged gargoyle, which add a sudden feeling of shock, of impending danger. Also, look at the large vertical black designs within the fence bars. They unify the picture. Now, without them, the whole design would seem to fall apart. Here, the black designs seem to be jumping all over the place. They're creating a feeling of chaos and action. But the pattern, although it's seemingly jumpy, is really quite consistent. It rivets your eye on the action.
Now, the blank areas are arranged here to create a pleasing circular movement. These two slashes across the bottom add action and unity. Here's our final example.
The light coming from the left is casting everything on the right in deep shadow. The heavy black shadow area emphasizes the feeling of a horror story. Now, just by looking at the design of the panel, you know it's no humor or romance strip.
Notice the way the black areas in the background give a feeling of realism and detail without detracting from the two important figures.
This panel is heavy, it's melodramatic, and yet it's clear. In a word, it's Marvel. In summation, the penciler draws his panels in, what else? Pencil. Then they must be finished by the inker. Now it's up to the inker to decide where and how boldly to apply his black ink. The inker figures prominently in determining the mood, the design, and the clarity of each panel. Thus, when you seriously study comic book artwork, be conscious of two complementary elements: the basic pencil drawing and the inked version. See? And you thought it was going to be complicated.
That about wraps it up for now.
Obviously, no one tape can substitute for an entire art course. But we hope we have at least presented you a broad overview, illustrating the most important elements of style, drama, and design that go into the making of a Marvel comic book. Now, one last word before we turn you loose to unleash your talent upon a breathlessly waiting world. To be a great artist, and Marvel isn't interested in any other kind, you've got to do three things: draw, draw, and then draw some more.
No one can make you a great comic book artist. You have to do it on your own. You have to want it enough to be willing to work at it night and day. It isn't easy, but if you've got the stuff, you won't let anything stop you.
And if one day you find yourself drawing for Marvel, then we're lucky. But even if we've simply helped illuminate an art form that we all enjoy, it was still worthwhile. So hang in there, hero, and take care of yourself. Remember, the best lies just ahead.